The night my sister sailed off on her 5-day Caribbean cruise without me, I stepped onto Maui in a black dress and a private helicopter the Pacific at my back, and every guest exactly where I wanted them. By sunset, Island Lux had my photos splashed across Explore, and in the middle of her brand deal live stream, her smile froze as the comments filled with my name. I was never asking for her seat. I was making a table she could never sit at. I was closing the month on a quiet Friday when my phone lit up with the kind of cheerful chaos that usually means someone in my family has found a new way to congratulate themselves. I let it buzz against the desk while I reconciled a stubborn line item for travel expenses. Senior accountant at North Shore Equity sounds glossy when you say it out loud, but most days it is me a spreadsheet and a stubborn number that refuses to behave. The phone kept humming. I finally flipped it over and saw the banner from the Lane family thread. Fireworks emojis, palm trees, blue hearts, a video thumbnail of turquoise water and a gleaming white ship. I tapped in because of course I did. The thread opened on my sister's face, framed by blowout curls and perfect lashes. Brooke looked into the camera from a sunny kitchen in Los Angeles and told everyone she was celebrating 10 years of her channel with a family cruise to the Caribbean. She said the brand that sponsors her wellness line was covering everything. She said it would be 5 days of content and family and gratitude. She tilted the phone to show a printed itinerary on the island-themed quartz counter. She squealed in the exact pitch that makes her audience write that they feel like they are there with her. Hearts spilled up the screen. Not from me, from everyone else. My brother-in-law wrote that he already packed and it was not until next week. My cousins from Ohio wrote that they could not wait to snorkel with the stingrays. Aunt Rose from Scottsdale wrote that she would bring her white linen and a sun hat bigger than common sense. My mother Linda chimed in that she had found navy polos for Dad and the grandkids. My father Robert added a thumbs up because that is what he contributes to digital life. A link arrived from my sister's assistant with flight blocks from Chicago and New York to Miami, and then the group chat pulsed with check marks as people claimed their seats like it was musical chairs, and the music had never stopped for them. I scrolled back to the top to make sure I had not missed something. I forced my eyes to slow down and read for clues. Dear family, 10 years. Cruise. Group code. Book by Tuesday. There was the list of passengers for the brand manifest. Brooke, of course, her husband Matt, my parents, my aunt, 2 cousins, my cousin's boyfriend because content needs fresh faces. My name was not there. I set the phone face down and looked at the window. Chicago in late spring was doing that thing where it promised warmth, but kept a cold hand at your throat. Lake Michigan was a flat strip of steel beyond the buildings. Someone in the bullpen laughed at a meme. The office espresso machine hissed. A chart on my monitor waited for me to do my job and put every dollar in its lane. The word lane made me think of my last name, and it made my stomach dip. Back on the screen, the feed bounded forward. Brooke posted a mock-up of a thumbnail for the cruise reveal. 10 years with you on the sea. Our family says thank you. She wrote that everyone would finally get a well-deserved break. My mother added a line about how proud they were of Brooke for building something so meaningful. Dad followed with another thumbs up. My aunt posted a gif of people dancing in flowered shirts. My cousins dropped pineapple emojis like confetti. No one asked if I was coming. No one tagged me in a question about flights from O'Hare. No one said my name. I told myself that maybe the invite had gone to an old email. My personal address still carries a college domain and sometimes ends up in junk. I checked every folder, promotion, social spam, nothing. I checked my work email even though I do not use it for family things. Nothing there but invoices, a calendar hold for the quarterly partner call, and a note from payroll about commuter benefits. My phone buzzed again, and out of habit, I lifted it. The banner was from the family thread. A short video. I tapped. My sister had turned the camera to our mother. Linda beamed the way she does when a lens points her direction. She said this was what family is for, to lift each other up and celebrate together. She touched the paper itinerary like it was an heirloom. She said she could not wait to have everyone under one sky. My sister laughed and nudged her. "Tell them about the surprise, Mom." Linda leaned closer and said there would be a dinner on the ship to look back on 10 years and all the love. She name-checked people she knew would be watching the story later. She did not say my name. I could have texted in and asked about it. I could have typed a cheerful, "So excited, which row are we?" and waited for someone to realize I was not on the list and fix it quickly with an apology that would taste like paper. Instead, I slid the thread out of sight and finished my reconciliation. I downloaded the vendor receipts and coded them. I watched the green lights line up like a tiny parade proof that at least within this rectangle of numbers I existed, and things balanced when I touched them. At 5:30, I shut down my machine and walked out past the framed abstract prints that try to make a private equity floor look like a gallery. The elevators were slow. I watched my face in the mirrored doors and cataloged what it looked like not to react. 31. Hair pulled back for work. A coat that still had salt on it from the winter. I looked like the person who makes things happen for other people. Schedules. Reports. Car service when the partners forget the time. I thought about the effort my family makes when Brooke asks. Flights are booked. Schedules are cleared. Even the baby comes because content loves a baby. On the sidewalk, the air smelled like rain and hot dog carts. I walked toward the river because I did not want to go home yet. The phone buzzed again. I did not need to read it to know it was photos of luggage flat lays and polished pedicures. I clicked it anyway. My sister had posted the cruise boarding passes in a collage. First names, gate, zone. I scrolled through like a scientist scanning a slide. Brooke, Matt, Linda, Robert, Rose, Mason, Ella, Tyler, not Avery. I remember the first time I learned what an invitation felt like. It was 3rd grade, and a girl with ringlets and jelly sandals handed out pink paper to every desk but mine. The teacher frowned and told her to include everyone. The girl stared at me like I had already failed a test I did not know I was taking. She tore off an extra slip and gave it to me without looking. I tucked it in my backpack and did not go to the party. Years later, I still know the weight of a room when it decides you are not the point. By the time I reached the river, the lights on the bridges had blinked on. Office towers glowed like stacked fish tanks. I leaned against the rail and watched a tour boat push through the dark water. People on the deck lifted their phones at the Wrigley clock and the corncob towers and the reflections that make the city look soft. A gust came off the water and I pulled my coat tighter. I felt ridiculous for being a grown woman with a good job and a stable apartment and a retirement account who could still be winded by a missing name on a list. I tried again to give them an out. Maybe Brooke assumed I could not get the time off. Year-end had made me a ghost last December. Maybe my mother thought I would not want to be on camera. I do not love the way my voice sounds when Brooke tags me and asks me a question for her audience. Maybe someone somewhere had typed the wrong address and my boarding pass was sitting in a stranger's inbox. There is always a reasonable story if you want one. I tested each version and felt how thin it was. Then I let the truth land. They had planned a celebration of family and decided I did not belong on the deck when the cameras rolled. A couple stopped beside me and argued gently about whether to get deep dish or Thai. They did not look like they were deciding anyone's value. I stared at the tour boat as it slid under the bridge and thought about the math of attention in our house. Brooke learned early to pull light toward herself and keep it there. My mother learned to feed the flame. My father learned to point at it and nod. I learned to move quietly and make sure the bills were paid on time. The phone buzzed again. I lifted it ready to mute the entire thread, and my screen filled with my mother's text to me alone. She wrote that the cruise would be busy and maybe not my scene. She wrote that we would do something with just us after they returned. She added a line that said she hoped I understood because Brooke had a lot on the line. I stared at those words until the edges blurred. The thing about a soft voice is that it can cut you clean. I typed and deleted 3 versions of a reply. The first was polite and small. The second was a joke about motion sickness. The third was a single word that I would regret. I put the phone back in my pocket. I watched the river. In my head, I heard my father tell me that Brooke brings value to brands and timing matters. I heard my mother tell me not to take things so personally. I heard my sister's laugh glide over all of it like gloss. I walked home along Michigan Avenue, where the storefronts were lit like stages. I passed a jewelry store where a ring sparkled in a display like a star trapped under glass. I passed a hotel where a couple in satin crossed the lobby like they had auditioned for the moment. I climbed the stairs to my walk-up and let myself into the neat rectangle I have shaped to my life. A sofa, a bookshelf with spines that have creases in the right places, a plant that refuses to die. I turned on the kitchen light and stood very still. It would be easy to call Harper from college or Maya from my team and let the words scald their way out of me. It would be easy to drink a glass of something and fall asleep with the television on. It would be easy to write a long letter to my mother and explain what it feels like to be the empty chair. Instead, I set my keys in the dish, washed my hands, and opened my laptop. The blue light met my eyes with that unhelpful calm only a screen can offer. I opened the Lane family thread and read it end to end one more time like a forensic report. The timestamps, the attachment names, the way our aunt double-tapped my mother's praise the second it arrived. I scrolled back to the top. I took a breath and pressed leave conversation. The phone went quiet in my palm like a stopped watch. I did not cry. Not out of bravery, only because I felt the kind of clarity that comes when a verdict has been delivered and there is no appeal. An invitation is not paper or an email. It is a measurement. Today, a room full of people I share a name with measured me and found me optional. I sat at my kitchen table and let the sentence settle on my chest until it felt like it belonged to me and not to them. Outside, a siren moved down Clark Street and faded. Inside, the only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator and the click of my own breath. I closed the laptop without typing anything. I put a pot on the stove and boiled pasta because it was what I had. I ate standing up with the overhead light making a small cone on the counter. When I finished, I rinsed the bowl and set it on the rack. I turned off the kitchen light and the apartment went something close to dark. In the window, my reflection looked like a person who understands the arithmetic of being left out and is thinking about what to do next. I stood with that feeling a while longer and then went to find a pen. The next evening, I sat in my car outside my parents' house longer than I needed to. Their street in Evanston was washed in that yellow porch light glow that made everything look softer than it felt. Inside, I could see shapes moving in the dining room, my mother setting out wine glasses, my father leaning back in his chair like he was already mid-story. I smoothed my dress, the one I knew was safe enough not to be commented on, and finally walked up the steps. The smell of rosemary chicken and something buttery hit me as soon as I opened the door. My mother called out from the kitchen, her voice carrying that warm brightness she uses when company is over, even though tonight it was just family. My sister Brooke was already at the table, hair perfect, nails done in the same pale pink she wears for brand shoots. She looked up with that quick scan, the one that checks if you noticed her first. My father was laughing as he refilled her glass, his face lit in the kind of pride that leaves no room for anything else. I slipped into the chair at the far end, the one that has always felt like it could disappear without the table looking empty. Brooke was telling them about the shoot she had earlier in the day, how the lighting crew from the brand flew in just to get the right angle on her unboxing. My father chuckled like she had invented the idea of product photography. I reached for the breadbasket, waiting for a pause to tell them about the quarterly bonus I had just received, a small but solid recognition for months of work. I got as far as saying I had good news from work when Brooke cut in, her voice rising with that performative excitement she saves for breaking announcements. She said she could finally share that the wellness brand was not only sponsoring the cruise, but also flying in a film crew to shoot a mini documentary about her journey. My mother's hand went to her chest in mock surprise, even though I knew she had heard this before. She told Brooke how proud she was, how it was the perfect way to celebrate 10 years. My father tapped his wine glass against hers and said this was the kind of thing that set her apart. I closed my mouth and let the bread sit untouched on my plate. The moment for my news had slid under the table and vanished. My mother turned to me with a smile that was soft but carried an edge I have learned to hear. She said, "Your sister has a big announcement to make, soon try not to make the atmosphere tense." The room was still full of laughter and the clink of cutlery, but it felt like the air had thinned. I nodded, as if I understood, though the words landed cold and clear. I was no longer someone whose voice shifted the conversation in this house. Dinner moved on without me. Brooke described the outfits she was planning for each day of the cruise. My mother asked if she needed help packing. My father told a story about the time she filmed a sunrise yoga sequence on a cliff in Maui and how the local paper had covered it. They all laughed at the memory as if it were a family achievement. I sipped my water and kept my eyes on the candle in front of me, watching the way the flame bent when someone shifted in their chair. At one point, my mother asked if I was quiet because I was tired. I said work had been busy, which was true in the way that most things I tell them are true, but not complete. I did not say that every word tonight had reminded me of the cruise invitation I never got, of the list that did not have my name. I did not say that I could feel myself shrinking at this table, becoming a shape that filled space without adding to it. When dessert came out, a lemon tart Brooke said was from the bakery her brand had recently partnered with, I helped pass the plates. She thanked me without looking up from her phone, where she was scrolling through photos from earlier. My mother leaned toward her to see, and they tilted the screen away from the rest of us like it held a secret worth protecting. My father poured coffee and asked Brooke if she thought the ship's Wi-Fi would be strong enough for live streams. She said of course she had already negotiated it. I finished my coffee quickly and set the cup down with a quiet click. No one noticed. The conversation had moved to which excursions would make the best footage. My mother suggested the zip line. My father voted for the private beach dinner. Brooke laughed and said she would do both, maybe on the same day, because you have to keep the audience engaged. They nodded in agreement, like this was a mission that belonged to all of them. By the time I stood to leave, the plates were stacked, and my mother was talking about how early they would need to leave for the airport. She kissed my cheek lightly and said we would have our own dinner when they got back. My father walked me to the door, but stayed in the frame as if stepping outside would break the scene still unfolding behind him. Brooke called out a quick bye without looking up. Outside, the night was cooler than I expected. I walked to my car, slowly letting the sound of their voices fade behind me. In the driver's seat, I sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel, not starting the engine. The street was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you hear your own thoughts louder. I knew then that this was not just about a trip I was not taking. It was about the place I held in a family that had learned to run on someone else's spotlight. And it was about deciding if I wanted to keep standing in the shadows or find my own light. I turned the key and pulled away the house, shrinking in the rearview mirror, until it was just another warm shape in the dark. The road ahead was empty, and for the first time that night, so was the weight in my chest. The next morning I called my mother. It was early enough that I knew she would still be in her robe, sitting at the kitchen counter with her first coffee. She answered with that warm lift in her voice she uses when she thinks I am calling to chat. I asked why my name was not on the cruise list. There was a pause, just long enough for me to picture her looking down at the counter, buying herself a second. She said I never liked parties, that I was the quiet one who preferred staying in. She said the trip would be loud and full of filming, and she did not think it would be my scene. I leaned back against my couch, staring at the blank wall across from me. I told her maybe it was because I do not look right in the pictures. My tone was even almost flat, but I knew she heard the weight in it. She let out a small sigh, the kind that means she wants the conversation to drift away without anyone naming what it really is. She told me not to take it personally, that my sister had a lot riding on this. Then she asked if I had eaten breakfast yet, as if changing the subject could erase the question. I told her I had to go and ended the call. The apartment felt still in that way it does when you hang up after a conversation that went nowhere. The city outside was waking up, the low hum of traffic coming through the window. I poured myself another coffee, but it tasted thin. My eyes drifted to the notebook on my counter, the one I use when an idea refuses to let go. I thought about the table last night, how I sat there like an extra place setting. I thought about my mother's voice, kind but careful, and how it carried the message without saying it outright. I was not the image they wanted to show. I opened my laptop and typed Maui luxury rentals into the search bar. Pages of sunlit spaces filled the screen, each more perfect than the last. Whitewashed decks that opened to the sea, infinity pools that looked like they spilled into the horizon, palm shadows across polished stone. I clicked through each one, my fingers tracing the trackpad slowly, as if I were walking through the rooms myself. I was not looking for a seat on their ship. I was building a table of my own, one where I would decide who was seen. An hour passed before I realized I had been saving links in a new folder without even thinking about it. I imagined the sound of a helicopter touching down on a private lawn, the salt in the air, the kind of silence that feels chosen. I could see guests stepping out into light, greeted like they belonged there. I could see myself not as the one in the corner, but the one who had sent the invitation. The idea was not about revenge in the loud, messy way people like to post about. It was about creating a space where my presence was not optional. I called Harper. She picked up on the second ring, her voice still carrying the sleepy rasp of Los Angeles mornings. She asked if everything was okay, and I told her I needed her help planning something. She asked if it was work-related, and I said no, this was personal. I could hear the curiosity spark in her tone. Harper has known me since the days when our biggest plans were about which coffee shop to camp in with textbooks. She asked what I had in mind, and I told her I wanted a birthday in Maui, in a house that would make a film crew jealous. I could almost hear her sit up straighter. We talked about timing, about how soon she could fly out to scout in person. She knew chefs who could design a menu to match the ocean outside the window, stylists who could make even the most camera-shy guest look like they belonged on the cover of something. I told her I wanted it intimate, but impossible to ignore, the kind of gathering that leaves a mark without ever having to raise its voice. Harper laughed and said she already had 3 places in mind. After we hung up, I sat for a while in the quiet. The sun had shifted across the floor, casting a stripe of light across my knees. I thought about my mother's words again about being someone who likes the quiet. She was not wrong. I do like it. But quiet can be chosen, or it can be assigned to you. And I was done letting someone else decide which kind I lived in. I went back to my laptop and started a list of who I might invite. Not the people who would come out of obligation, or because they wanted to be seen in the photos, but the ones who had known me in ways that had nothing to do with family reputation. People who would notice if I was not in the room. My pen hovered over a name before I wrote it down. The list was short, but it felt solid. Outside, the late morning traffic thickened, horns blending with the low growl of buses. I made another coffee and set it beside the laptop, watching steam curl into the air. This was not about competing with a cruise or stealing anyone's spotlight. It was about lighting my own and inviting people into it. I clicked open another rental listing, this one with a long table under a pergola, lanterns strung across the beams. I could picture the seats filled, laughter carried out toward the sea. And in that picture, I was at the center, not because I demanded it, but because I built the place where everyone wanted to be. I closed the laptop and leaned back, letting the thoughts settle. There was no rush. The plan could take shape piece by piece, the way the light changes over the water, until you barely notice it has turned to gold. I stood stretched and walked to the window. The street below was alive, people moving in every direction with their own destinations. Somewhere in all of it, my sister was probably packing for her trip, lining up outfits for the camera. I let that thought pass without weight. My focus was elsewhere now, on a shoreline I could already see in my mind, and the sound of my own name being called to the head of the table. 2 weeks later, Harper's name lit up my phone just after sunrise. I answered, still wrapped in my robe, coffee warm in my hand. She said she had found the place, her voice quick with the kind of certainty she rarely wasted. Wailea oceanfront private gate, a view that made her go silent for a full minute when she first stepped onto the lanai. She told me the pool blended into the horizon and the sand below was soft enough to make you forget you were standing on Earth at all. I told her to book it. She laughed and said she already had, and the deposit was paid. From there, the plan grew fast. Harper sent me photos of the chef. She wanted a man whose resume read like the map of someone who had cooked on every coastline worth tasting. She said he would build the menu around what the local fisherman brought in that morning, the kind of food you could smell before it reached the table. She already had a stylist in mind, too, someone who could make a simple black dress feel like it belonged in a museum. I let her run with it, trusting the way she stitched details together without a seam showing. She told me she was bringing in a drone crew she had worked with on a Malibu wedding, the kind of operators who could make a glass of champagne look like a scene from a movie. When I asked if that was necessary, she reminded me this was not about modesty. It was about intention. She wanted every angle to say, I was the one who set the stage. I agreed, even as part of me wondered if I would feel like myself in that much light. By the third day, she looped in Darren, her friend, who handled contracts for high-profile clients. He spoke to me in the precise language of numbers and clauses, walking me through payment schedules and liability coverage in case the weather turned against us. He asked if I was comfortable wiring the balance from my personal account. I was. The money came from years of saying no to vacations, of keeping my car long past the point of style, of bonuses I had rolled into savings instead of spending. Watching it transfer out of my account felt less like loss and more like moving a piece into the right square. We were 48 hours out when Harper called from the property. I could hear the ocean behind her, a low, constant rush that made me want to close my eyes and be there already. She told me the florist had arrived early and was draping orchids over the trellis where we would dine. The linens had been pressed and laid out white, so clean they caught the morning sun. The staff had tested the lighting across the lawn, adjusting each fixture so the glow would feel like candlelight even from 20 feet away. I pictured it all in my head, each detail locking into place, like a blueprint I had been carrying without knowing. Harper asked about the guest list again, reminding me it was still small enough to feel deliberate. I told her I wanted it that way. She had reached everyone, confirmed flights, arranged transfers from the airport. For 2 of them, she booked the helicopter, not because it was necessary, but because it was the right way to arrive. She said the pilot would land just before sunset when the water looked like it had been brushed with gold. I told her I would take the same flight. That night I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook open, running my pen over the numbers one more time. The total was sharp but not frightening. I had enough left to cover my own peace of mind, and that was all I needed. I was not building this to prove something to Brooke. I was not building it for my parents or for anyone who had decided I was not the right shape for their picture. I was building it because I wanted to stand in a place where my presence could not be treated like a suggestion. I imagined the moment I stepped out of the helicopter, the wind pressing against my dress, the sound of blades fading as I walked toward the table. No one rushing me into a frame, no one shuffling me to the edge. Just my own pace, my own place. The idea filled me in a way I had not felt in months. The day before departure, Harper sent me a video. It was a slow pan across the lawn at sunset, the sea stretching wide behind it, the sky painted in layers of orange and rose. The table was already set for the rehearsal dinner she had arranged for the staff and crew. Glasses caught the light, silverware lay perfectly aligned, and the chairs waited in even rows. At the head of the table was an empty seat, draped with a simple shawl to protect it from the breeze. She ended the video there. I watched it twice before I realized I was holding my breath. I packed that night without rush, folding dresses into soft layers, setting shoes in cloth bags. Into my carry-on, I slipped the one piece of jewelry I had kept from my grandmother, a gold bracelet that had never felt right at family gatherings, but seemed made for this one. When I zipped the suitcase shut, the sound was final, the way a door closes when you know you will not open it again. By morning, I was on my way to the airport, the city still gray in the early light. My phone buzzed with a weather alert for Maui, a small chance of showers, nothing to break the plan. Harper texted that the chef had found perfect yellowfin at the market and was already marinating it for the main course. I pictured the scent rising in the warm air, the low hum of conversation starting as guests arrived. The image stayed with me as the plane lifted off the city, shrinking below, replaced by cloud and then open sky. I closed my eyes and let it carry me forward. When the wheels touched down in Kahului, the air felt heavier, the kind that wraps around you and makes the rest of the world seem far away. Harper was waiting just beyond the terminal sunglasses in her hair, a grin like she had been holding in every detail until now. She hugged me quickly, then guided me toward the waiting car, her voice full of small updates about the table settings, the flowers, the weather holding steady. We curved along the coastline, the water flashing between palm trunks, and she mentioned casually that there was one guest she had not told me about yet. His name left her mouth like it was nothing but. I felt the shift in my chest. Elliot West. She said he had been on her list because of his work in brand communications, that his presence would be good for the kind of coverage she wanted. She admitted she had not told him I was the host. My eyes stayed on the line where the ocean met the sky, the same calm blue on both sides. I asked when he was arriving. She said tomorrow on the morning flight, confirmed, and that he had hesitated when she finally told him. I nodded and let the hum of the road fill the silence. That evening, I walked the length of the property alone. The house was a quiet geometry of glass and stone, open to the sea, but anchored by heavy wooden beams. The lawn sloped gently toward the edge, where the sand began. Lanterns hung from the pergola over the dining table, their glass catching the last light. I traced my fingers over the chair at the head of the table and thought about the last time I had seen Elliot. It had been years ago, before Brooke pulled him into her orbit, before I understood how quickly someone could be rewritten in the story you thought you were part of. The next day came warm and clear, the breeze carrying salt and the scent of the chef's early prep. Guests arrived in pairs and small clusters, their greetings easy, the sound of voices mixing with the slow crash of waves below. I moved among them, checking that everyone had what they needed, that the rhythm of the afternoon was unfolding without force. It was near sunset when Harper appeared at my shoulder, her hand light on my arm. She said he was here. I turned toward the entrance and saw him walking across the lawn. He wore a light gray suit that caught the wind, his hair neater than I remembered the years sharpening the lines around his eyes. He scanned the space as he approached, the kind of careful look someone uses when they are trying to measure the distance between what they expected and what they found. Our eyes met before he reached the group, and for a moment the sound around us thinned. There was no jolt of anger, no urge to look away. I held his gaze the way you hold your ground in an unfamiliar current, steady and without apology. He slowed, something unreadable flickering across his face, then gave the smallest nod before Harper intercepted him with introductions. I let her lead him toward the bar, her voice warm and practiced, and turned back to a conversation I had been having with one of the guests from Los Angeles. As the evening deepened, I caught glimpses of him at the edges of the crowd, listening more than speaking, his posture precise, his smile reserved. Once I saw him watching me from across the lawn, his hand wrapped loosely around a glass. The last of the sun was burning low, pulling gold from the water and shadow from the cliffs. I did not look away, not quickly, not in the way that gives a moment power. I let the connection settle between us for a breath, then turned toward the sound of my name from another guest. Later, as the lanterns began to glow, Harper brought him over. She framed it as a reunion, though neither of us reached for the kind of small talk people expect in those moments. He said it had been a long time, his voice measured, almost careful. I agreed. He asked how I had been, and I told him I was where I needed to be. The words seemed to pause him for half a second before he smiled, faint but real. There was no mention of Brooke, no tracing back over the reasons we had ended, no autopsy of something long buried. Just two people standing under the same light again, aware of the years in between. When he stepped away to speak with another guest, I felt the cool brush of night air against my shoulders. The tide was shifting, the sound of it rising to meet the music that had started low in the background. I moved toward the table, running my hand lightly along its edge, each place set and waiting. The chair at the head stood exactly where it should be, anchored, ready. I could feel the first shapes of the evening locking into place, not because of who had shown up, but because of what I had built for them to arrive to. The morning of my birthday broke clear and windless, the kind of stillness that makes every sound feel sharper. From the helipad above the shoreline, the pilot waited beside the open door, the blades already slicing the air in a low, steady rhythm. I stepped toward it in a black silk dress, that moved just enough with the breeze my hair pinned high so nothing could fall in my face. Harper stood nearby in a headset, her hand lifted in a small wave, eyes scanning the horizon the way she always does when she is orchestrating more than one thing at once. The flight was short but stretched in my mind. The water below shifted from deep blue to green as we neared the coast, sunlight flashing in patterns that looked too deliberate to be accidental. When the villa came into view, it rose from the cliffside in layers of stone and glass, the lawn already dotted with white chairs, and the glow of lanterns that would only grow warmer as night came. From above, it looked like a scene already captured, framed perfectly by the curve of the island and the open Pacific beyond. We touched down on the private landing pad just beyond the property. The rush of air from the blades curled against my shoulders as I stepped out, the sound fading as the engine powered down. No phones were held up. That had been the point. Harper had made it clear to the guests that this was not an event for social media feeds. If the night was to be seen, it would be on our terms. Inside, the house breathed light. Wide glass doors slid open to the terrace, where the dining table stretched in an unbroken line toward the sea. The orchids hung exactly as Harper had described, soft white blooms spilling down like they had grown there on their own. The chef's team moved quietly in the background, the scent of seared fish and citrus drifting through the air. I could feel the hum of preparation in every corner, a balance between movement and restraint. By mid-afternoon, the photographer arrived. He worked for Island Lux, a travel magazine that had featured every coastline worth knowing, and he was here because Harper had called in a favor. He was quick to understand the tone we wanted moving through the space, without staging anything too sharply. A tilt of the head here, the sweep of a hand against the table there, all captured in the way light naturally found them. He asked me to walk the edge of the lawn once the sea at my back, and I did my steps, measured my gaze steady on a point just past the camera. The first guests began to arrive as the sun angled lower. They came in pairs, some from the mainland, some already on the island for other reasons, each chosen because their presence meant something beyond a name on a list. Harper met them at the entrance and brought them through the villa, letting the view do most of the work. Laughter began to layer itself over the soft music playing from hidden speakers, the kind of sound that told me the space was doing exactly what it was meant to. Elliot arrived later than most, his gray suit replaced by something lighter, more suited to the air. He greeted me without ceremony, his eyes scanning the scene before settling on mine. There was a flicker there, not of surprise, but of recognition. And then he moved on, speaking with a guest near the bar. I let the moment pass, turning instead to a woman from Los Angeles who was telling me about her latest project in marine conservation. As twilight settled, the photographer began working in earnest. The images were not for me to post. They were for Island Lux, who would run them in a spread titled, "Naomi Clark Celebrates 31 in Maui with Quiet Force." The phrase had been agreed on in advance, a line that held weight without reaching for drama. The guests knew the boundaries. No one tagged my sister. No one mentioned her name at all. But I knew the people who needed to see this would. Dinner began as the last of the sky shifted to deep blue. The table glowed under the lanterns, the orchids casting soft shadows across the plates. The food arrived in courses, each one placed with a precision that felt effortless. I moved between seats, speaking with each guest, the conversation weaving from travel to art to the small details of life that never make it into headlines. There was no toast, no performance, just the low, steady rhythm of people choosing to be where they were. At one point, I stepped back from the table and let the scene settle into my mind. The waves below were just visible in the dark white edges catching the light from the terrace. The air was warm against my skin, the sound of laughter carrying just far enough to mix with the ocean. In that moment, it was clear that the success of the night was not measured in how many people saw it happen, but in the fact that it existed at all, exactly as I had imagined. The photographer took a few last frames and slipped away quietly. Harper caught my eye from across the table, a small nod passing between us. The work was done, and it had landed exactly where we wanted it to. I returned to my seat at the head of the table, my plate untouched for a moment, as I let the sound of the evening surround me. The sea kept moving in the dark, and the night held steady around us. Somewhere out on the Caribbean, my sister was smiling into a camera. I knew because Harper's phone buzzed with a notification, and she tilted it just enough for me to see a live stream thumbnail. Brooke stood on the deck of the ship, the ocean stretched behind her like a postcard, her hair catching the light in a way that was probably planned. She was mid-sentence talking about a brand partnership when the comments section began to shift. Hearts still floated up the screen, but the words started changing. My name appeared. A link to Island Lux's post followed. Then a flood of screenshots, each one showing me at the villa, the table, the sea. Harper set the phone down without a word. The evening here carried on as if nothing outside it existed, but I could picture the exact moment my sister's expression would harden. She would see the headline, the photographs that didn't need a caption, and the fact that none of them had her name in the tags. Her voice would keep moving for the audience, but a small break in her eyes would give her away to anyone watching closely. By the time the last dessert plates were cleared, my own phone vibrated. My mother's name lit the screen. I excused myself from the table and walked toward the edge of the terrace, the ocean just a darker line against the night. Her voice came fast, a mix of confusion and defense. She asked if I knew what was going on. Said Brooke had called her in the middle of filming upset, saying she felt blindsided. I told her I was celebrating my birthday. There was a pause long enough for the waves to fill it. She said she didn't understand why it had to be this way. I told her I had to go and ended the call. Not 10 minutes later, another call came in, this time from my father. He didn't bother with preamble. He asked if I had done this to hurt my sister. His tone was not angry, just sharp enough to make the question feel like an accusation. I told him the truth. I said I was not trying to hurt anyone, I was making sure I wasn't erased. Silence met me again, but his was heavier. I could almost hear the weight of all the things he wanted to say, but didn't. I ended the call before the conversation could slip into old patterns. I slipped the phone into my bag and stayed outside for a while, letting the night cool my skin. Inside, the music was low and warm, the kind that wraps around conversations instead of cutting through them. Through the glass, I could see Harper leaning in to speak with the chef, Elliot listening to someone with his head tilted just enough to show he was paying attention. None of them knew the words that had just been said to me. None of them needed to. When I stepped back inside, no one asked where I had gone. I returned to my seat, the rhythm of the evening undisturbed. My plate had been replaced with fresh fruit and a small slice of cake, a candle flickering gently in the breeze from the open doors. Harper gave me a look that was both a question and an answer. I nodded once. We let the conversation move on. The rest of the night unfolded without rush. Guests drifted to the terrace to watch the waves, others lingered at the table with coffee and wine. I found myself listening more than speaking, the sound of other people's stories cushioning me against the sharp edges of the calls. The photographer had been right to capture the early light. Now the glow belonged to the space itself, and to the people who filled it. It was late when the last guests left, their footsteps soft on the stone path toward the cars. Harper stayed behind, helping the staff clear the last glasses. I stood by the open doors, the night air pulling in the salt and the sound of the tide. The ocean was endless, and somewhere far from here, my sister's ship was cutting through it. I imagined her phone still lighting up the images, still spreading her voice, still working to stay even. The thought didn't sting or thrill. It just sat there as steady as the water. When the villa was finally quiet, I walked out to the lawn alone. The lantern still swayed slightly, casting arcs of light onto the grass. I sat in one of the chairs, the one beside my own, at the head of the table, and let the silence settle. My phone was in my hand, the last call still logged on the screen. I powered it down and set it face down on the table. The waves kept moving, and I stayed there until they were the only sound left. The bar was nearly empty when I walked back inside. Most of the staff had slipped into quiet routines, stacking glasses and wiping down counters. Elliot stood near the far end, his jacket draped over one arm, a half-finished drink in front of him. He looked up when I approached, as if he had been waiting for a space to open between us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The music from the terrace was low enough that the sound of the ice shifting in his glass filled the pause. He set the glass down, and told me he wanted to apologize. His voice was steady, but quieter than I remembered. He said he had been wrong to disappear the way he did years ago, that it was not about me, but about what he thought he needed to keep. He told me Brooke had given him a choice back then to be the person in her photos, her public life, or to keep any connection to me. If he wanted her world, I could not be in it. He said he had stayed silent because the work she could bring him was valuable, because he was afraid of losing his footing in an industry that depends on visibility. I watched him as he spoke, noting the way his eyes stayed level with mine, not flinching away from the truth he was laying down. There was no attempt to rewrite it into something softer. He said now it did not matter that the ties he had clung to had already unraveled. He was here because Harper had asked, but also because he wanted to see what I had built for myself. I felt the weight of his words, but not the pull of old anger. I told him thank you not as a dismissal, but as an acknowledgement. There was nothing else to add. The story was already complete, and I had no interest in reopening it. My gratitude was not forgiveness handed out like a gift. It was simply the recognition that he had said what needed saying. He nodded as if he understood that was all there would be. He finished his drink, set the glass aside, and told me it was a beautiful night. Then he picked up his jacket and left without looking back. I stayed where I was for a while. The bar now almost entirely cleared the air, carrying the faint scent of citrus from the drinks that had been poured earlier. Outside, the last guests were gathering for their departures. The helicopter crew moved with practiced efficiency, guiding people toward the landing area. I stepped onto the balcony, just as the rotors began to spin, the blades cutting through the warm air in heavy, rhythmic beats. The lights from the villa glowed against the dark, framing the lawn, like a stage set after the performance has ended. The helicopter lifted slowly, the downdraft rippling across the terrace. I watched as it rose above the cliff, the figures inside barely visible, their outlines caught in brief flashes from the cabin lights. The sound grew louder for a moment, then softened as it pulled away, the shape of it shrinking against the vast black of the ocean. I stayed there until it was no more than a point of light, then, until even that disappeared. The silence that followed was different from the quiet earlier in the evening. This was not the absence of noise, but the presence of something still. I leaned against the railing, the wood warm under my hands, and let the air settle around me. The sea was a dark mirror stretching out in every direction, unbroken except for the steady pulse of the tide. For the first time in a long while, the solitude did not feel like something handed to me as a consequence. It felt chosen, like a room I had walked into and decided to stay in. The night pressed close, the lanterns swaying gently in the distance, and I let the horizon hold me there without asking for anything in return. The sun was already sharp against the glass when I opened my eyes. The villa was quiet, only the low hum of the ceiling fan moving the air above me. I made coffee and carried it to the terrace. The ocean stretched wide and indifferent in front of me. My phone was still powered down where I had left it. I let it stay that way until the mug was empty. When I finally turned it on, the notifications began to flood the screen. Mentions, tags, screenshots. Near the top was a post from a lifestyle editor I had met once at a gallery opening in Los Angeles. A single photo from last night, me standing at the head of the table, hair swept back the sea behind me. The caption read, "Not all luxury is loud. Some women don't ask for the stage, they own it." It had been shared thousands of times already. I scrolled through the comments without pausing on any of them. More screenshots appeared. People had clipped the post and placed it next to images from my sister's live stream. The contrast was stark. Her followers debated in real time, some asking why they had never heard of me, others assuming I was the one with the brand deal. One comment kept appearing each time with more likes than the last. Wait, Naomi's the younger sister. I thought she was the one with the brand deal. Somewhere on the water, my sister was still filming. A new notification showed her live again, voice raised slightly, as she insisted that my birthday had nothing to do with her trip. I didn't watch it. The numbers told me enough. Viewers were leaving midstream, the comment section sliding off topic, people posting side-by-side comparisons she couldn't control. I walked down to the edge of the lawn where the grass gave way to stone. The tide was low, the water pulling back to show the dark rock underneath. A breeze lifted the hem of my dress, carrying the faint smell of salt and hibiscus from the garden. My phone buzzed in my hand. Harper. She sent a single line. You won without touching her. I put the phone in my pocket and sat on the wall, watching a boat cut slowly across the horizon. In a world where image was a weapon, I had learned something the hard way. You don't always have to aim for the target. Sometimes you just step into the light and let the rest arrange itself. Behind me, the staff began moving chairs back into place, readying the space for the next guests who would rent the villa. I stayed where I was until the sun rose high enough to flatten the shadows, the sea still moving in its steady rhythm, carrying everything away that did not matter. I left Maui 2 days later, the flight back to Chicago quiet in a way I welcomed. No one recognized me in the airport, and I slipped through the terminal with a scarf around my hair and sunglasses pressed close to my face. The air was colder when I stepped outside at O'Hare, sharp enough to sting my hands as I waited for the car. My apartment was exactly as I had left it, the faint scent of coffee still in the tin, the plants by the window leaning toward the thin winter light. The invitation came 3 days later, an email from my mother with the subject line, "Family Dinner." No explanation, no mention of my birthday, just the date and time and the address of my parents' house. I read it twice before closing my laptop. It sat in the back of my mind for the rest of the day, a quiet weight I didn't decide to pick up until the morning of. Their street was lined with cars when I pulled in. Inside, the air was warm, heavy with the smell of roast chicken and rosemary. My mother greeted me at the door, her smile careful, as if she had practiced it in the mirror. My father stayed in the dining room talking with Hannah. She turned when I walked in, her eyes narrowing for a fraction of a second before she stood to kiss my cheek. We sat down to eat the silverware, clinking softly against the plates. Conversation moved around the table, my parents asking about Hannah's trip, her upcoming projects, the people she met on the cruise. I cut into my chicken listening without adding anything. At one point, my father asked if I had any travel planned, and I said no. The silence that followed was short but noticeable. Halfway through the meal, Hannah set down her fork and looked at me directly. Her voice was steady but tight. "Do you have any idea how hurt I was by what you did?" I took a sip of water before answering. "You can choose who gets invited on your cruise. You don't get to choose who will be remembered after it leaves the dock." My father's hand tightened around his fork, the metal making a faint sound against the plate. My mother exhaled slowly, her gaze fixed on the tablecloth. No one spoke for a while after that. The sound of the clock in the hallway became louder than the conversation. When dessert was served, I pushed my plate slightly away, my appetite gone. I stayed until the coffee was poured, then placed my napkin on the table and stood. "Thank you for dinner," I said, my voice even. There was no apology in it, no offer to smooth over what had been said. My mother rose to walk me to the door, but my father stayed seated, staring at the cup in his hand. Outside, the night was colder than I expected. I walked to my car with my coat pulled close, the house glowing behind me in the dark. The windows reflected the dining room, the figures inside moving slowly, their voices too muffled to hear. I got in, started the engine, and sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel. The warmth from the vents filled the car. But I didn't drive away right away. I looked once more at the house, at the place where I had learned to keep quiet so other people could feel comfortable. Then I put the car in gear and left it behind, the taillights catching in the wet street as I turned the corner and disappeared from view. Palm Springs in late spring always felt like someone had turned the world into a photograph. The colors too sharp, the sun too clean, the air too still. 3 months after that dinner, Hannah was getting married at a desert resort that looked like it had been designed for magazine spreads. I wasn't there. I didn't make a speech about it, didn't send regrets through our parents. I just mailed a small ivory envelope to Hannah's address with a short note written in my own steady handwriting. I am not standing outside anymore. I am simply no longer standing in that game. There was nothing else to explain. Harper told me later that guests asked where I was between champagne toasts and photo sessions. "Where's Naomi? Is she running late? Was she invited Hannah in her lace gown and carefully staged smile? Just laughed it off as if my absence were a whimsical choice instead of a decision carved out of months of clarity. Elliot didn't show up either, though. No one seemed to want to ask her why. There was no explosion, no tabloid scandal, no gossip headline. The wedding happened exactly the way the venue had promised, in their glossy brochure floral arches, curated playlists, gold flatware, catching the last light of the day. And yet, the photos Hannah posted stayed in their own corner of the internet. No one reposted them, no one wrote captions about how magical it was, no one remembered to keep the conversation going. Silence settled over it like desert dust, fine and inescapable. In Hannah's world, where applause was oxygen, that silence was the sharpest blade anyone could ever draw. I went back to my office the Monday after the wedding and found the usual stack of reports waiting on my desk. The city outside my window was its usual winter gray, the kind that makes people walk faster, heads down against the wind. I took off my coat, set my bag on the chair, and turned on my computer. There was comfort in the routine in knowing exactly what needed to be done and when. That week, my quarterly bonus hit my account. I opened the numbers, looked at the total, and knew before I closed the window what I wanted to do with part of it. I called a contact at a small community foundation I had worked with before and told her I wanted to set up a scholarship fund for young women of color who were studying finance and investment. No press releases, no sponsorship dinners, no plaques on a wall. Just a quiet transfer of funds and a note in their records that the money was there to be used. When the paperwork came through, I signed it over lunch at my desk, the sound of the city drifting up from the street below. It felt clean, unentangled, the kind of gesture that didn't need to be seen to matter. One evening as I was shutting down my computer, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Elliot. You never needed to take apart your sister's spotlight. You only needed to step out of her shadow. The light finds you on its own. I read it twice, felt the corners of my mouth lift just slightly, and then deleted it. Some words are meant to pass through, not settle in. I powered down my phone, left it in my bag, and walked home with the early dark folding over the city. That night I cleared my dining table and spread out a fresh notebook, pens, and a calendar for the year ahead. I sketched out ideas, not for anyone else's approval, but for myself. A trip I wanted to take alone. A course I wanted to enroll in. Small things, steady things that felt like bricks in a foundation only I could stand on. The apartment was silent except for the faint hum of the heat kicking in. No one knocked. No one called. The quiet didn't feel empty this time. It felt like a room I had built door open, but with no one hovering in the doorway waiting to be let in or turned away. When I finally set my pen down, I looked at the clean pages ahead of me, all blank, all mine. I didn't think about Hannah. I didn't think about the cruise or the wedding, or the way her voice used to fill every conversation. I thought about the weight of my own pen in my hand and how it felt to write something that belonged entirely to me. When you are erased from someone else's story, you don't have to fight for a line in their script. You can pick up your own pen, you can start your own chapter, and sometimes the people who once wrote you out will find themselves reading every word, unable to look away.